Why the Soviet Union collapsed. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a complex and multifaceted event influenced by various factors. Here are 20 key points that provide an in-depth explanation of why the Soviet Union collapsed. Economic stagnation. The Soviet economy faced persistent structural problems, inefficiencies, and a lack of innovation leading to stagnant growth and declining productivity. Centralized planning. The centrally planned economic system under the Soviet Union stifled innovation and efficiency. The lack of market mechanisms, price signals, and competition hindered the allocation of resources and productive decision-making. Examples: long production cycles, inefficiencies in production, and overemphasis on heavy industry at the expense of consumer goods. Command economy. The command economy resulted in a disconnect between supply and demand. Central authorities determined production targets, prices, and resource allocation, leading to distorted signals and misallocated resources. Examples: persistent shortages of consumer goods, including clothing, appliances, and automobiles, despite high demand. Lack of incentives and motivation. The absence of incentives for individual initiative, innovation, and entrepreneurship hampered productivity and economic growth. State ownership and control undermined the drive for efficiency and personal success. Examples: workers lacking motivation to increase productivity due to limited prospects for career advancement or financial rewards. Bureaucracy and corruption. A cumbersome bureaucratic system with excessive red tape and corruption stifled economic activity. Bribes, favoritism, and nepotism distorted resource allocation and hindered fair competition. Examples: obtaining permits, licenses, and raw materials often involved lengthy bureaucratic processes and corrupt practices. Technological stagnation. The Soviet Union faced challenges in adapting and integrating technological advancements. Limited access to international technologies, lack of investment in research and development, and bureaucratic hurdles hindered technological innovation. Examples: lagging behind in areas such as computer technology, consumer electronics, and information systems. Inefficient agriculture. Collectivization of agriculture and lack of incentives for farmers resulted in low productivity and chronic food shortages. Central planning and resource allocation failed to address the diverse needs and conditions of different regions. Examples: inadequate investment in farming techniques, inefficient distribution systems, and declining agricultural yields. Declining quality of goods. The focus on meeting production targets rather than quality standards led to the production of low-quality goods. Lack of consumer choice and competition contributed to a decline in product quality and innovation. Examples: substandard manufacturing practices, poorly designed products, and limited variety of consumer goods. State monopolies and lack of competition. The dominance of state-controlled enterprises and absence of competition limited market efficiency and hindered productivity. The lack of market forces impeded the development of diverse industries and inhibited specialization. Examples: state monopolies in sectors such as energy, transportation, and heavy industry led to inefficiencies and reduced incentives for improvement. These examples highlight how economic stagnation, resulting from the limitations of the centrally planned system, lack of market mechanisms, and inadequate incentives, contributed to the decline of the Soviet economy. The inability to adapt to changing global market dynamics, meet consumer demands, and drive sustainable economic growth undermined the stability and resilience of the Soviet Union. Centralized planning. The centrally planned economic system failed to adapt to changing global market dynamics, resulting in resource misallocation and an inability to meet consumer demands. Lack of market mechanisms. Centralized planning under the Soviet Union meant that production decisions, resource allocation, and price determination were controlled by central authorities. The absence of market mechanisms such as supply and demand forces distorted price signals and hindered efficient resource allocation. Examples: prices of goods often did not reflect their true value or production costs, leading to inefficiencies and misallocation of resources. Inflexibility and slow decision-making. Centralized planning resulted in a slow decision-making process due to the hierarchical and bureaucratic nature of the system. Adaptation to changing market conditions, technological advancements, and consumer demands was sluggish. Examples: decision-making on production targets, investments, and resource allocation required extensive bureaucratic procedures and approval, leading to delays and missed opportunities. Lack of entrepreneurship and innovation. Centralized planning suppressed individual initiative, entrepreneurship, and innovation. The focus on meeting production quotas rather than encouraging creativity and competition stifled innovation and limited the diversification of industries. Examples: individuals lacked incentives to take risks, develop new ideas, or explore alternative business models due to the absence of market rewards and competition. Resource misallocation. Centralized planning often resulted in the misallocation of resources due to inaccurate information and limited feedback mechanisms. Resources were allocated based on central directives rather than market demand or efficiency considerations. Examples: overinvestment in heavy industry at the expense of consumer goods, leading to imbalances in the economy and inadequate production of goods desired by the population. Lack of customer orientation. Centralized planning focused on meeting production targets set by the central authorities rather than responding to consumer preferences. Consumer needs and preferences were secondary to the fulfillment of planned quotas. Examples: production decisions were made without direct input from consumers, resulting in a limited range of products and poor quality goods. Inefficiencies and waste. The absence of competitive forces and profit motives contributed to inefficiencies and waste within the centrally planned system. Lack of accountability and market competition led to complacency, overstaffing, and the inefficient use of resources. Examples: excessive bureaucracy, redundant production facilities, and poor quality control due to the lack of market pressure for efficiency. Lack of price signals. Centralized planning meant that prices were determined by central authorities rather than market forces. The lack of price signals distorted resource allocation, production decisions, and consumer choices. Examples: artificially low prices for essential goods and services, leading to excessive demand and shortages, or artificially high prices for non-essential goods, resulting in limited affordability and excess supply. These examples highlight how centralized planning, by limiting market mechanisms, stifling innovation and entrepreneurship, and distorting resource allocation, contributed to the economic inefficiencies and stagnation that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Inefficient industrial sector. The Soviet Union's heavy emphasis on heavy industry neglected other sectors, leading to a lack of consumer goods and declining living standards. Lack of technological innovation. The Soviet Union faced challenges in technological innovation, with limited investment in research and development. Bureaucratic hurdles and a lack of incentives for innovation hindered the adoption and integration of advanced technologies. Examples: lagging behind in computer technology, semiconductor production, and other high-tech industries. Inadequate production techniques. Inefficiencies in production techniques, outdated equipment, and inadequate training contributed to low productivity levels. The absence of market competition and incentives for efficiency hindered the adoption of modern production methods. Examples: inefficient production processes, low automation levels, and reliance on manual labor in various industries. Poor quality control. The centrally planned system often prioritized meeting production targets over ensuring high-quality goods. The lack of market pressures and consumer feedback mechanisms resulted in inadequate quality control practices. Examples: substandard manufacturing practices, inconsistent product quality, and limited consumer choice in terms of quality. Imbalanced industrial structure. The Soviet Union's heavy emphasis on heavy industry neglected the development of other sectors, such as consumer goods. The imbalanced industrial structure led to limited production of goods desired by the population and declining living standards. Examples: insufficient production of consumer goods like clothing, appliances, and automobiles despite high demand. Inefficient supply chains. Inadequate infrastructure, poor transportation networks, and logistical challenges hindered the efficient movement of goods. Centralized planning often failed to address the complexities of supply chains, resulting in delays and inefficiencies. Examples: bottlenecks in transportation networks, inadequate storage facilities, and difficulties in coordinating production and distribution. Lack of competition. The absence of market competition within the centrally planned system undermined incentives for efficiency and innovation. State-controlled monopolies and the lack of competitive pressures limited improvements in productivity and product quality. Examples: limited product variety, lack of consumer choice, and reduced pressure for continuous improvement. Environmental degradation. The industrial sector under the Soviet Union often neglected environmental considerations, leading to pollution and ecological damage. Inadequate regulations and lack of accountability contributed to unsustainable industrial practices. Examples: water and air pollution from heavy industries, soil degradation, and inadequate waste management practices. These examples illustrate how the inefficiencies within the industrial sector resulting from inadequate technological innovation, poor quality control, imbalanced industrial structure, and lack of competition contributed to the economic stagnation and decline of the Soviet Union. Command economy. The lack of market mechanisms and price signals hindered efficiency, innovation, and competition. Lack of price signals. In a command economy, prices were set by central authorities rather than being determined by market forces. The lack of price signals distorted resource allocation, production decisions, and consumer behavior. Examples: artificially low prices for essential goods leading to excessive demand and shortages, or artificially high prices for non-essential goods resulting in limited affordability and excess supply. Inefficient resource allocation. Central authorities, rather than market forces, determined resource allocation in a command economy. Decisions on investment, production targets, and resource distribution were often based on central directives rather than efficiency considerations. Examples: overinvestment in heavy industry at the expense of consumer goods, leading to imbalances in the economy and inadequate production of goods desired by the population. Lack of incentives for efficiency. In a command economy, the absence of market competition and profit motives undermined incentives for efficiency and productivity. Workers and enterprises lacked direct financial rewards for improving productivity or meeting consumer demands. Examples: limited motivation for workers to increase productivity or improve quality due to the absence of market rewards and competition. Bureaucracy and centralized decision-making. The command economy relied on centralized decision-making and extensive bureaucratic procedures. This led to slow and inflexible decision-making processes, hindering adaptation to changing market conditions. Examples: lengthy bureaucratic procedures for obtaining permits, licenses, and raw materials, resulting in delays and missed opportunities. Lack of consumer orientation. A command economy often prioritized meeting production targets set by central authorities rather than responding to consumer preferences. Consumer needs and preferences were secondary to the fulfillment of planned quotas. Examples: limited consumer choice, poor product quality and inadequate variety of goods and services, lack of entrepreneurship and innovation. The absence of market mechanisms and competition suppressed individual initiative, entrepreneurship, and innovation. The focus on meeting production quotas rather than encouraging creativity and competition stifled innovation and limited the diversification of industries. Examples: limited opportunities for individuals to pursue entrepreneurial ventures, lack of incentives for innovation and risk taking. Inadequate supply and distribution systems. The command economy faced challenges in ensuring efficient supply chains and distribution networks. The centralized planning approach often failed to address the complexities of supply and demand dynamics. Examples: bottlenecks in transportation networks, inadequate storage facilities, and difficulties in coordinating production and distribution. These examples highlight how the command economy, with its lack of price signals, inefficient resource allocation, limited incentives for efficiency, and centralized decision-making, contributed to economic inefficiencies and stagnation, ultimately leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Rising debt. The Soviet Union accumulated significant foreign debt, mainly due to military spending, which strained the economy and limited investment in productive sectors. Military spending. The Soviet Union engaged in a costly arms race with the United States, resulting in a substantial increase in military spending. The allocation of a significant portion of the budget to defense strained the economy and contributed to rising debt. Examples: investment in nuclear weapons, military technology, and the maintenance of a large standing army, foreign loans, and debts. The Soviet Union relied on foreign loans to finance various initiatives, including industrial projects, infrastructure development, and imports of consumer goods. Accumulating foreign debt burdened the country's financial position and led to increased debt repayment obligations. Examples: borrowing from Western countries, international organizations, and private creditors to fund development projects. Lack of productive investments. The Soviet Union directed a significant portion of borrowed funds towards non-productive investments, such as unprofitable enterprises and military projects. The lack of focus on productive sectors hindered economic growth and limited the ability to generate revenue for debt repayment. Examples: investments in industries with low returns, inefficient state-owned enterprises, and overemphasis on heavy industry. Economic imbalances. The growing debt burden exacerbated economic imbalances, including budget deficits, trade deficits, and inflationary pressures. These imbalances weakened the overall financial position of the Soviet Union and strained its capacity to service its debts. Examples: increased reliance on foreign imports, limited export competitiveness, and difficulties in maintaining fiscal stability. Inadequate debt management. The Soviet Union faced challenges effectively managing its growing debt burden. Limited financial transparency, inefficient debt servicing mechanisms, and inadequate fiscal policies contributed to the accumulation of unsustainable debt. Examples: inadequate monitoring of debt levels, insufficient efforts to negotiate favorable terms, and lack of strategies to address the debt crisis. Declining revenue streams. Economic stagnation and inefficiencies within the Soviet economy resulted in declining revenue streams. This limited the government's ability to generate sufficient income for debt repayment and meet growing financial obligations. Examples: sluggish economic growth, declining tax revenues, and reduced profitability of state-owned enterprises. Debt repayment challenges. The Soviet Union faced challenges in meeting its debt repayment obligations, leading to default and further deterioration of its financial position. Difficulties in servicing debts eroded creditor confidence and limited access to additional financing. Examples: delayed debt payments, renegotiation of debt terms, and increasing reliance on new loans to service existing debts. These examples illustrate how rising debt, driven by military spending, foreign loans, and inadequate debt management, contributed to the economic challenges faced by the Soviet Union and ultimately played a role in its collapse. Nationalism and ethnic conflicts. Ethnic tensions and nationalist movements within the Soviet republics undermined the unity and stability of the country. Ethnic diversity and autonomy demands. The Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic federation comprising various republics and regions with distinct cultural, linguistic, and historical backgrounds. Nationalist movements within these republics, fueled by desires for greater autonomy and self-determination, challenged Soviet authority. Examples: the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, demanding independence, and the rise of nationalist movements in Ukraine, Georgia, and other republics. Suppression of national identity. The Soviet regime sought to suppress nationalist sentiments and promote a unified Soviet identity. Repression of cultural and linguistic expressions, as well as restrictions on religious practices, created tensions and resentment. Examples: prohibition of regional languages, censorship of cultural expressions, and persecution of nationalist intellectuals and activists. Ethnic tensions and conflicts. The Soviet Union experienced various ethnic tensions and conflicts driven by historical grievances, territorial disputes, and competition for resources and power. These conflicts eroded societal cohesion and strained the unity of the Federation. Examples: Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, tensions between ethnic Russians and non-Russian populations in Central Asia, economic disparities among regions. Economic disparities among different Soviet republics and regions exacerbated nationalist sentiments. Unequal distribution of resources and perceived economic advantages for certain regions fueled demands for greater autonomy and economic control. Examples: republics like Ukraine and Kazakhstan feeling economically disadvantaged compared to Moscow and the Russian Federation. Centralized control and resentment. The centralized nature of the Soviet regime bred resentment and perceptions of Moscow's dominance among non-Russian ethnic groups. The concentration of political power and economic resources in the hands of the central government exacerbated nationalist sentiments. Examples: claims of economic exploitation by resource-rich regions and perceptions of cultural suppression by the dominant Russian ethnic group. Independence movements and separatism. Nationalist movements advocating for independence gained momentum as the Soviet Union faced political and economic challenges. Demands for self-determination and separatism weakened the unity and stability of the Federation. Examples: the independence movements in the Baltic states, Georgia's pursuit of independence, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union into independent nations. Political reaction and crackdowns. The Soviet leadership's response to nationalist movements varied, ranging from attempts at accommodation to harsh crackdowns. Repressive measures and military interventions in certain regions further fueled nationalist sentiments and resistance. Examples: the Soviet military crackdown on pro-independence demonstrations in Lithuania and the violent suppression of the independence movement in Georgia. These examples illustrate how nationalism, ethnic tensions, demands for autonomy, and political reactions contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The fragmentation of the Federation along ethnic lines, driven by nationalist aspirations and grievances, weakened the unity and stability of the Soviet state. Political repression. The repressive policies of the Soviet regime stifled dissent, suppressed free expression, and created social discontent. Suppression of dissent. The Soviet regime employed various tactics to suppress dissent, including censorship, surveillance, and intimidation. Freedom of speech, expression, and association were severely curtailed, stifling open dialogue and dissenting viewpoints. Examples: imprisonment and persecution of political dissidents, censorship of literature and media critical of the regime, and surveillance of individuals suspected of dissent, persecution of political activists. The Soviet authorities targeted political activists who challenged the regime's authority or advocated for political reforms. Arrests, imprisonment, forced labor, and physical abuse were common forms of repression. Examples: the persecution of human rights activists like Andrei Sakharov, dissidents like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and political opposition figures such as Boris Yeltsin. Control of education and media. The Soviet regime exercised tight control over education and media to shape public opinion and propagate state ideology. School curricula and media outlets were used to indoctrinate citizens with communist ideology and suppress alternative narratives. Examples: state-controlled textbooks, promoting Marxist-Leninist ideology, censorship of literature and art deemed subversive, and state-run media serving as a propaganda tool. Show trials and purges. The Soviet regime conducted show trials and purges to eliminate perceived threats to its authority and maintain control. Falsely accused individuals were subjected to public trials, often resulting in harsh punishments or executions. Examples: the Moscow trials of the 1930s, where prominent Bolsheviks were accused of treason, and the purges under Stalin, targeting perceived enemies within the party and society. Gulag system. The Soviet Union operated a vast network of forced labor camps known as the Gulag system. Dissidents, political opponents, and individuals deemed counter-revolutionary were subjected to imprisonment, hard labor, and harsh conditions. Examples: the Solovki prison camp, notorious for housing political prisoners, and the vast network of Gulag camps across the Soviet Union. Suppression of nationalist movements. Nationalist movements within the Soviet republics challenging central control were met with repression. Independence movements and demands for greater autonomy were seen as threats to the regime's authority and territorial integrity. Examples: the violent suppression of independence movements in the Baltic states, the crackdown on nationalist movements in Ukraine and Georgia, and the imposition of martial law in Lithuania. Fear and self-censorship. The climate of fear created by political repression led to self-censorship among the general population. People refrained from expressing dissenting opinions or engaging in activities perceived as politically risky. Examples: individuals refraining from openly criticizing the regime, limiting political discussions in public spaces, and avoiding associations with perceived dissidents. These examples illustrate how political repression, through the suppression of dissent, persecution of activists, control of education and media, show trials, the Gulag system, and the suppression of nationalist movements, contributed to the erosion of public trust, stifling of individual freedoms, and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. Leadership crisis. Successive leaders after Stalin lacked the charisma, authority, and vision to effectively govern and address the mounting challenges. Lack of charismatic and visionary leaders. Following the era of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union lacked leaders with the charisma, authority, and vision necessary to effectively govern and address mounting challenges. The absence of strong leadership contributed to a sense of disillusionment and a loss of faith in the ruling elite. Examples: The leadership of Konstantin Chernenko and Yuri Andropov, who had limited tenures and failed to introduce significant reforms or inspire public confidence. Aging leadership and succession issues. The Soviet leadership during the latter years of the Soviet Union was characterized by advanced age and health issues. The lack of a clear and smooth process for leadership succession created uncertainties and power struggles. Examples: the frequent changes in leadership during the 1980s, including the deaths of Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko in quick succession. Failure to address economic challenges. The leadership crisis was evident in the inability of successive leaders to effectively address the economic challenges faced by the Soviet Union. The lack of innovative economic policies and meaningful reforms contributed to economic stagnation and declining living standards. Examples: the limited success of Mikhail Gorbachev's reform efforts, including glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, in revitalizing the economy. Political factionalism and power struggles. The leadership crisis was exacerbated by internal political factionalism and power struggles within the ruling Communist Party. Infighting and rivalries hindered effective governance and created divisions within the party and the broader society. Examples: the struggles for power within the Politburo, factional battles between reformists and hardliners, and the August coup attempt in 1991, lack of public confidence and trust. The leadership crisis eroded public confidence and trust in the ruling elite and the Communist Party. Failures to address economic problems, political repression, and societal challenges contributed to a loss of faith in the leadership's ability to govern effectively. Examples: widespread public disillusionment, increasing calls for political reform and democratization, and rising support for nationalist and independence movements. Disconnect from changing global realities. The leadership crisis was evident in the Soviet Union's inability to adapt to changing global dynamics and the end of the Cold War. The failure to recognize the need for political and economic reforms to keep pace with the changing international landscape contributed to the collapse. Examples: the inability to respond effectively to the reforms introduced in other countries, such as China and Eastern European nations, and the failure to grasp the significance of shifts in global politics. Lack of public accountability. The leadership crisis was characterized by a lack of transparency, accountability, and mechanisms for public participation in decision-making processes. The absence of democratic institutions and mechanisms for feedback and accountability limited the leadership's ability to address societal grievances effectively. Examples: limited avenues for public participation, lack of open dialogue, and minimal accountability for policy failures and corruption. These examples illustrate how the leadership crisis, resulting from a lack of visionary leaders, aging leadership, failure to address economic challenges, political factionalism, and a loss of public confidence, contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Arms race. The Soviet Union's intense rivalry with the United States in the Cold War led to an unsustainable arms race, diverting resources from the civilian sector. Economic burden. The intense arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States placed a tremendous economic burden on the Soviet economy. The allocation of substantial resources to military spending diverted funds away from sectors such as infrastructure, social welfare, and consumer goods production. Examples: extensive investments in the development and production of nuclear weapons, missile systems, and military technologies, strain on resources. The arms race created a strain on the Soviet Union's resources, including raw materials, energy, and skilled labor. The demand for these resources to sustain military production often exceeded their availability, leading to shortages and inefficiencies in other sectors. Examples: the diversion of key resources such as steel, aluminum, and petroleum to military production, resulting in shortages for civilian industries. Decline in living standards. The heavy investment in the arms race limited resources available for improving living standards and addressing societal needs. Economic stagnation and declining consumer goods production resulted in deteriorating living conditions for the Soviet population. Examples: inadequate housing, shortages of essential goods, long queues for basic necessities, and limited access to quality healthcare and education. Technological and scientific diversion. The arms race diverted scientific and technological resources towards military research and development at the expense of other areas. The focus on military technologies limited advancements in sectors such as consumer electronics, computer science, and healthcare. Examples: limited availability of consumer technologies, outdated infrastructure in non-military sectors, and reduced funding for scientific research outside of defense-related areas. Impact on innovation and productivity. The arms race had a negative impact on innovation and productivity in non-military sectors of the economy. Limited resources, centralized decision-making, and a focus on military production hindered innovation and entrepreneurial activities. Examples: reduced investment in research and development, limited diversification of industries, and a lack of incentives for non-military innovation. Escalation of tensions. The arms race intensified political tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, leading to a heightened state of confrontation and instability. This climate of hostility contributed to a sense of insecurity, fear, and a cycle of mistrust between the superpowers. Examples: heightened Cold War rhetoric, proxy conflicts in various regions, and the increased risk of accidental nuclear war. Drain on the economy. The resources allocated to the arms race drained the Soviet economy and contributed to its overall inefficiency. The maintenance of a large military-industrial complex placed a strain on the country's finances and productivity. Examples: high military expenditure relative to GDP, bloated defense industries with excess capacity, and a lack of diversification in the economy. These examples illustrate how the arms race, through its economic burden, strain on resources, decline in living standards, diversion of technological and scientific resources, impact on innovation and productivity, escalation of tensions, and drain on the economy, contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Burden of military expenditure. The substantial military spending strained the Soviet economy, diverting resources from essential public services and economic development. Economic strain. The Soviet Union's significant military expenditure placed an enormous strain on its economy. The allocation of substantial resources to military spending limited investments in crucial sectors such as infrastructure, healthcare, education, and consumer goods production. Examples: extensive funding for the development, production, and maintenance of a large military, including personnel salaries, weaponry, and military infrastructure. Diversion of resources. The burden of military expenditure diverted resources away from civilian sectors, contributing to inefficiencies and shortages. Vital resources such as raw materials, energy, and skilled labor were directed toward military production, exacerbating scarcities in other industries. Examples: prioritization of military equipment production over consumer goods manufacturing, diversion of strategic resources like steel and petroleum to the military sector. Decline in living standards. The heavy military spending adversely affected living standards for the Soviet population. Limited resources for consumer goods production resulted in shortages, reduced variety, and declining quality of essential items. Examples: inadequate housing, shortages of food and consumer goods, long queues for basic necessities, and limited access to healthcare and education. Economic stagnation. The burden of military expenditure contributed to economic stagnation within the Soviet Union. Limited investments in innovation, infrastructure, and non-military industries hindered overall economic growth and diversification. Examples: sluggish GDP growth, insufficient technological advancements in non-military sectors, and reduced productivity outside the military-industrial complex. Technological diversion. The heavy focus on military expenditure diverted scientific and technological resources toward military research and development. This led to the neglect of civilian sectors, hampering innovation and technological advancements in non-military fields. Examples: limited investment in consumer electronics, computer science, healthcare, and environmental technologies due to priority given to military projects. Opportunity cost. The burden of military expenditure incurred a significant opportunity cost, as the funds could have been used for social welfare programs, infrastructure development, or economic reforms. The inability to allocate resources efficiently for the betterment of society contributed to dissatisfaction and public disillusionment. Examples: limited investments in education and healthcare, inadequate infrastructure development, and missed opportunities for economic diversification. Strain on public finances. The substantial military expenditure strained public finances, leading to budget deficits and increasing national debt. The need to finance military operations and maintain a large military-industrial complex created fiscal imbalances. Examples: increased government borrowing, higher tax burdens, and reduced funding for social welfare programs. These examples illustrate how the burden of military expenditure through economic strain, resource diversion, declining living standards, economic stagnation, technological diversion, opportunity cost, and strain on public finances contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Inadequate agricultural sector. The collectivization of agriculture and lack of incentives for farmers resulted in chronic food shortages and dependence on imports. Collective farming system. The Soviet Union implemented a collective farming system where agricultural production was organized in large state-controlled collective farms, kolkhozes, and state farms, sovkhozes. This system, characterized by inefficiency, lack of incentives, and poor management, hindered agricultural productivity. Examples: lack of individual ownership and decision-making power, centralized control over production decisions, and limited accountability for performance. Inefficient resource allocation. Inadequate resource allocation and distribution hindered agricultural productivity in the Soviet Union. Centralized planning and bureaucratic procedures limited farmers' access to necessary resources such as fertilizers, machinery, and credit. Examples: long bureaucratic processes for acquiring resources, inadequate supply of fertilizers and equipment, and limited access to credit for investment. Low productivity and technology. The agricultural sector in the Soviet Union suffered from low productivity and a lack of advanced agricultural technologies, insufficient investments in research and development, outdated machinery, and inadequate training contributed to the low output. Examples: limited adoption of modern farming techniques, reliance on manual labor, outdated irrigation systems, and inadequate access to modern machinery. Collective farm inefficiencies. The collective farm system experienced inefficiencies, including poor coordination, lack of motivation, and unequal distribution of resources. The absence of individual incentives and the collectivization of decision-making hindered productivity and innovation. Examples: lack of individual initiative and responsibility, unproductive work practices, and insufficient rewards for high-performing farmers. Inadequate infrastructure and storage. The agricultural sector faced challenges in terms of inadequate infrastructure and storage facilities. Insufficient transportation networks, lack of modern storage facilities, and inadequate processing capacity contributed to post-harvest losses and inefficiencies. Examples: Limited availability of refrigeration facilities, poor road networks for transporting agricultural products, and inadequate grain storage leading to spoilage. Environmental degradation. Agricultural practices in the Soviet Union often neglected environmental considerations, leading to land degradation and reduced agricultural productivity. Inadequate soil conservation practices and water management contributed to declining agricultural yields. Examples: soil erosion, overuse of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and contamination of water sources. Food shortages and dependency on imports. The inadequate agricultural sector resulted in chronic food shortages and the Soviet Union's increasing dependence on imports to meet its food needs. Insufficient domestic production, inefficiencies in distribution, and limited consumer access to a diverse range of food products created challenges. Examples: long queues for basic food items, limited variety of products, reliance on imports to meet demand, and food rationing in certain periods. These examples illustrate how the inadequate agricultural sector, through issues with the collective farming system, inefficient resource allocation, low productivity and technology, collective farm inefficiencies, inadequate infrastructure and storage, environmental degradation, and food shortages contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Loss of ideological legitimacy. The Soviet Union's communist ideology lost credibility over time, leading to a decline in popular support and a sense of disillusionment among the population. Disillusionment with Marxist, Leninist ideology. Over time, the Soviet population became disillusioned with the Marxist, Leninist ideology that had served as the foundation of the Soviet state. Failures in implementing socialist principles, economic stagnation, and the contrast with the perceived prosperity of capitalist countries eroded faith in the ideology. Examples: growing skepticism towards communist ideals, declining belief in the superiority of the socialist system, and questioning of the party's ability to deliver on its promises, economic stagnation and inefficiency. The Soviet Union faced persistent economic stagnation and inefficiency, challenging the credibility of its economic model. The inability to provide a comparable standard of living to that of capitalist nations undermined the ideological legitimacy of the socialist system. Examples: declining industrial productivity, shortages of consumer goods, long queues for basic necessities, and limited access to quality healthcare and education. Western cultural influence. Increased exposure to Western culture, particularly through the circulation of information, media, and travel, undermined Soviet ideological control. Western values and consumerism appealed to the Soviet population, contrasting with the restrictions and shortages experienced in the Soviet system. Examples: the popularity of Western music, fashion, and literature, increasing access to foreign media, and the desire for Western consumer goods. Nationalist and ethnic movements. The rise of nationalist and ethnic movements within the Soviet Union challenged the ideological cohesion of the state. Demands for greater autonomy and self-determination conflicted with the Soviet ideology of a unified socialist state. Examples: independence movements in the Baltic states, nationalist movements in Ukraine and Georgia, and calls for cultural preservation and linguistic rights, political corruption and bureaucratic mismanagement. Rampant political corruption and bureaucratic mismanagement undermined the credibility of the Soviet system. The stark contrast between the professed ideals of socialism and the reality of cronyism, nepotism, and abuse of power eroded faith in the ruling elite. Examples: elite privileges, embezzlement of state resources, favoritism within the party hierarchy, and the concentration of power in the hands of a few. Suppression of dissent and lack of freedom. The Soviet regime's suppression of dissent, lack of political freedoms and limitations on individual expression contributed to the loss of ideological legitimacy. The gap between the professed values of equality and freedom and the reality of political repression undermined public support for the regime. Examples: censorship of critical literature and media, persecution of dissidents, and limitations on freedom of speech and association, failure of perestroika and glasnost, the implementation of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, by Mikhail Gorbachev, intended to revive the Soviet system, paradoxically highlighted its shortcomings. The reforms brought to light the scale of economic problems, corruption, and political dysfunction, further eroding faith in the system. Examples: increased public awareness of economic challenges, exposure of corruption scandals, and public criticism of the party's leadership. These examples illustrate how the loss of ideological legitimacy through disillusionment with Marxist-Leninist ideology, economic stagnation, Western cultural influence, nationalist movements, political corruption, suppression of dissent, and the failure of reforms contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Information restrictions. The lack of access to independent information and censorship prevented the dissemination of alternative viewpoints and hindered the ability to address societal challenges effectively. State-controlled media. The Soviet Union maintained strict control over media outlets, ensuring they propagated the official party line and suppressed dissenting voices. State-controlled newspapers, television, radio, and publishing houses limited access to alternative viewpoints and critical analysis. Examples: Pravda and Izvestia, the two major state-run newspapers, propagating government propaganda and suppressing anti-Soviet narratives. Censorship of literature and art. The Soviet regime implemented extensive censorship of literature, art, and cultural expressions that deviated from official ideology. Works critical of the regime, those exploring sensitive historical events or expressing non-conformist ideas, were banned or heavily edited. Examples: the banning of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago and the persecution of artists like Dmitry Shostakovich for deviating from Soviet aesthetics. Limited access to foreign information. The Soviet Union restricted access to foreign media, books, and information sources, isolating its population from external influences. Limited exposure to alternative perspectives and foreign developments contributed to a skewed understanding of global events. Examples: strict control over the import and distribution of foreign books, limited access to international news sources, and jamming of foreign radio broadcasts. Suppression of dissident voices. The Soviet regime actively suppressed dissident voices and persecuted individuals who expressed dissenting opinions or challenged the official narrative. Dissidents, writers, intellectuals, and political activists faced imprisonment, harassment, and exile. Examples: the imprisonment of Andrei Sakharov, the Nobel laureate and human rights activist, and the persecution of Alexander Solzhenitsyn for his critical writings. Limited academic freedom. Academic institutions in the Soviet Union were subject to strict ideological control and limited academic freedom. Research and scholarship were expected to align with Marxist, Leninist principles, stifling innovative thinking and critical analysis. Examples: censorship of academic publications, suppression of alternative theories or interpretations, and limitations on research topics. Propagation of state propaganda. The Soviet regime extensively used propaganda to shape public opinion, promote loyalty to the party, and maintain ideological control. Propaganda campaigns presented a positive image of the regime, distorted historical events, and demonized perceived enemies. Examples: promoting the cult of personality around leaders like Stalin, glorifying Soviet achievements, and propagating anti-Western narratives. Lack of information transparency. The Soviet government lacked transparency in providing accurate and timely information about critical events, disasters, and policy decisions. The manipulation of information and concealment of failures created a climate of mistrust and suspicion among the population. Examples: the cover-up of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, limited information about economic challenges, and lack of public access to government data. These examples illustrate how information restrictions through state-controlled media, censorship of literature and art, limited access to foreign information, suppression of dissident voices, limited academic freedom, propagation of state propaganda, and lack of information transparency contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Democratization movements. Movements advocating for political reforms, freedom of speech, and democratization gained momentum across Eastern Europe, inspiring similar demands within the Soviet Union. Dissident movements. Dissident movements within the Soviet Union emerged as a response to the repressive political system. Activists, intellectuals, and human rights advocates called for political reforms, greater freedom, and democratic rights. Examples: the Helsinki Watch Group, Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, and the Moscow-Helsinki Group. Calls for political pluralism. Democratization movements advocated for political pluralism, demanding the establishment of multi-party systems and free elections. They aimed to challenge the monopoly of power held by the Communist Party and promote political competition. Examples: the emergence of opposition parties like the Democratic Union in Russia and the Popular Front in the Baltic states. Grassroots movements. Democratization movements gained strength through grassroots organizing and mobilization of civil society. Citizens actively participated in protests, strikes, and public demonstrations demanding political change. Examples: the Solidarity Movement in Poland, the People's Movement of Ukraine, RUK, and the Baltic Way demonstration. Trade unions and labor movements. Trade unions and labor movements played a significant role in democratization efforts, advocating for workers' rights and political reform. They organized strikes, demonstrations, and negotiations with the government, demanding democratic representation. Examples: the Solidarity Trade Union in Poland, the Independent Trade Union Movement in Hungary, and the Miners' Strike in Ukraine. Intellectual and cultural movements. Intellectual and cultural movements emerged as centers of dissent and catalysts for democratization. Writers, artists, and cultural figures played a crucial role in challenging the regime and promoting democratic values. Examples: the literary circles associated with samizdat, self-published, literature cultural movements like the Czechoslovak Plastic People of the Universe and the Moscow Conceptualist Art Movement. Nationalist movements. Nationalist movements seeking greater autonomy or independence also contributed to the democratization of the Soviet Union. These movements challenged the centralized power of the Soviet state and demanded self-determination. Examples: the Popular Front movements in the Baltic states, the national independence movements in Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia. Rise of opposition leaders. Opposition leaders emerged as key figures in the democratization movements, providing leadership and rallying support. They challenged the ruling party, advocated for democratic reforms, and gained popular support. Examples: Lech Walesa in Poland, Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, Boris Yeltsin in Russia, and Vytautas Landsbergis in Lithuania. These examples illustrate how democratization movements, through dissident movements, calls for political pluralism, grassroots activism, trade unions, intellectual and cultural movements, nationalist movements, and the rise of opposition leaders, contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Baltic independence movements. The independence movements in the Baltic republics challenged Soviet control and set a precedent for other regions to pursue self-determination. Popular Front movements. Popular Front movements emerged in the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as broad-based political and social movements advocating for independence. These movements united various groups, including intellectuals, activists, cultural figures, and ordinary citizens in their pursuit of self-determination. Examples: the Popular Front of Estonia, Ravarin, Popular Front of Latvia, Latvijas Tautas Fronte, and Sejudis in Lithuania. Mass demonstrations. Mass demonstrations played a crucial role in the Baltic independence movements, showcasing public support for independence and challenging Soviet rule. Hundreds of thousands of people participated in peaceful protests, forming human chains and organizing rallies demanding freedom. Examples: the Baltic Way demonstration, where approximately 2 million people formed a human chain spanning across the Baltic states in support of independence. Singing Revolution. The Baltic independence movements were characterized by the Singing Revolution, a series of mass singing events that became powerful symbols of resistance and national identity. Citizens gathered to sing national songs, including patriotic and band songs, fostering a sense of unity and cultural pride. Examples: the Singing Revolution events held at the song festivals in Estonia and Latvia and the Song Festival of Lithuania. Restoration of independence declarations. The Baltic states made historic declarations to restore their independence, challenging the Soviet authorities' control over the region. These declarations asserted the sovereignty and statehood of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, marking significant milestones in their struggle for independence. Examples: the Estonian Declaration of Independence, 1988, the Latvian Declaration of Independence, 1990, and the Act of the Reestablishment of the State of Lithuania, 1990. Nonviolent resistance. The Baltic independence movements largely embraced nonviolent resistance strategies, emphasizing peaceful protests, civil disobedience, and passive resistance. This approach aimed to maintain moral high ground, garner international support, and minimize the risk of violent conflict. Examples: peaceful demonstrations, sit-ins, strikes, and the use of symbolic acts such as singing, flag waving, and cultural expressions. International support. The Baltic independence movements received significant international support, which helped amplify their cause and put pressure on the Soviet Union. Diplomatic recognition, solidarity movements, and vocal support from Western nations contributed to the legitimacy and visibility of the Baltic states' struggle. Examples: statements of support from prominent world leaders, the Baltic Way demonstration receiving international media coverage, and diplomatic efforts to secure recognition. Negotiations and transition to independence. Negotiations between the Baltic states and the Soviet Union played a crucial role in the peaceful transition to independence. Agreements were reached, paving the way for the withdrawal of Soviet troops, restoration of state institutions, and the establishment of independent governments. Examples: the Baltic states' negotiations with Soviet authorities culminating in the signing of agreements such as the Treaty on the Final Settlement with respect to Germany, 1990, and the Alma-Ata Declaration, 1991. These examples illustrate how Baltic independence movements, through popular front movements, mass demonstrations, the Singing Revolution, restoration of independence declarations, nonviolent resistance, international support, and negotiations contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Economic liberalization in other countries. The success of market-oriented reforms in countries like China and Poland demonstrated alternative paths to economic development and increased pressure for change within the Soviet Union. Market reforms and capitalist transition. The economic liberation in other countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, involved the transition from centrally planned economies to market-oriented systems. Market reforms, privatization, and the embrace of capitalist principles challenged the socialist economic model upheld by the Soviet Union. Examples: the economic reforms in Poland under Solidarity led governments, Hungary's new economic mechanism, and the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. Opening of borders and trade liberalization. The economic liberation in other countries led to the opening of borders, trade liberalization, and integration into the global economy. Increased economic cooperation with Western countries and access to global markets exposed the limitations of the Soviet economic system. Examples: the creation of the European Single Market trade agreements with Western countries and the emergence of export-oriented industries. Foreign direct investment and technological transfer. Economic liberalization attracted foreign direct investment and facilitated the transfer of technology and know-how. Foreign capital and expertise helped modernize industries, increase productivity, and improve competitiveness, contrasting with the Soviet Union's stagnating economy. Examples: Western companies investing in newly liberalized economies, joint ventures between domestic and foreign firms, and technology transfers through licensing agreements. Privatization of state-owned enterprises. The privatization of state-owned enterprises and the emergence of private businesses in other countries showcased the advantages of market-driven economies. The success and efficiency of privatized industries highlighted the limitations of the Soviet Union's state-controlled economy. Examples: privatization programs in Eastern European countries, the transformation of state-owned enterprises into private corporations, and the growth of small and medium-sized businesses. Foreign aid and financial assistance. The economic liberation in other countries attracted foreign aid and financial assistance, enabling them to invest in infrastructure, education, and technological advancements. This assistance fostered economic growth and development, creating further disparities between these countries and the Soviet Union. Examples: financial aid from international organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, grants and loans from Western governments, and technical assistance programs. Emergence of new economic powerhouses. The economic liberation in other countries saw the emergence of new economic powerhouses, challenging the Soviet Union's economic dominance. Countries like China and India embraced market reforms and experienced rapid economic growth, becoming global economic players. Examples: China's economic reforms and the opening of special economic zones, India's economic liberalization policies, and their growing influence on the global stage. Brain drain and loss of talent. The economic liberation in other countries led to a brain drain from the Soviet Union as talented individuals sought better opportunities abroad. The immigration of skilled professionals and intellectuals weakened the Soviet economy and its capacity for innovation. Examples: scientists, engineers, and academics leaving the Soviet Union to work in Western countries, seeking better salaries, resources, and research opportunities. These examples illustrate how the economic liberation in other countries, through market reforms, trade liberalization, foreign direct investment, privatization, foreign aid, emergence of new economic powerhouses, and brain drain contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's reforms. Mikhail Gorbachev's attempts at reform, such as glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring exposed deep-seated problems in the system but also led to increased social and political unrest. Perestroika, restructuring. Perestroika aimed to revitalize the Soviet economy through economic restructuring and increased autonomy for enterprises. The introduction of market mechanisms, decentralization, and limited private ownership were intended to improve economic efficiency. Examples: allowing limited private businesses, introducing profit incentives, and granting more decision-making power to individual enterprises. Glasnost, openness. Glasnost sought to promote political openness, transparency, and freedom of expression within Soviet society. It aimed to encourage public participation, facilitate discussion of social issues, and address historical injustices. Examples: easing censorship, allowing greater media freedom, permitting public discussions on previously taboo topics, and acknowledging past political repression. Democratization efforts. Gorbachev initiated political reforms to increase political pluralism and democratic participation within the Soviet system. Multi-candidate elections and the establishment of a Congress of People's Deputies aimed to enhance political representation. Examples: allowing competitive elections, expanding the role of political parties, and granting limited political freedoms to individuals. Arms control and international relations. Gorbachev pursued arms control agreements and improved relations with Western powers, aiming to reduce military spending and ease tensions. Efforts such as the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, INF treaty, and engagement with the United States signaled a desire for peaceful coexistence. Examples: negotiating arms reduction agreements, engaging in summits with world leaders, and advocating for global disarmament. Nationalities policy. Gorbachev attempted to address long-standing ethnic tensions and promote greater autonomy for Soviet republics and regions. The policy aimed to recognize and accommodate the diverse nationalities within the Soviet Union. Examples: granting more cultural and political rights to national minorities, supporting national languages, and devolving some powers to the republics. Unintended consequences. Gorbachev's reforms unintentionally unleashed forces that undermined the stability of the Soviet Union. The relaxation of controls and increased openness created opportunities for nationalist movements and demands for independence. Examples: the rise of independence movements in the Baltic states, ethnic tensions in regions like Nagorno-Karabakh, and demands for greater sovereignty from republics. Economic challenges and backlash. Gorbachev's reforms faced resistance from conservative elements within the party and economic challenges. The transition from a centrally planned economy to a more market-oriented system led to disruptions, shortages, and inflation. Examples: resistance from entrenched party officials and conservative factions, opposition from industrial sectors impacted by restructuring, and public discontent due to economic difficulties. Loss of party control. Gorbachev's reforms weakened the Communist Party's control over society and eroded its legitimacy. The opening up of political space allowed for the emergence of alternative political movements and challenges to party authority. Examples: the rise of opposition groups and alternative political parties, increasing calls for political pluralism, and challenges to the party's monopoly on power. These examples illustrate how Gorbachev's reforms, through perestroika, glasnost, democratization efforts, arms control, nationalities, policy, unintended consequences, economic challenges, and the loss of party control, contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Political fragmentation. The rise of nationalist movements and demands for greater autonomy led to a fracturing of Soviet authority and weakened central control. Rise of nationalist movements. The Soviet Union was a diverse federation of republics and regions with different ethnic, cultural, and historical backgrounds. The rise of nationalist movements within various Soviet republics challenged the unity of the Soviet state and its centralized control. Examples: the Baltic independence movements, Ukrainian nationalism, and demands for self-determination in Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Independence declarations. Political fragmentation was exemplified by the declarations of independence by various Soviet republics. These declarations asserted their sovereignty and challenged the authority of the Central Soviet government. Examples: The declarations of independence by the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Ukraine, Georgia, and other republics. Power struggles within the Communist Party. Political fragmentation was also evident within the Communist Party, the ruling party of the Soviet Union. Factionalism, competing interests, and power struggles weakened the unity and effectiveness of the party. Examples: divisions between reformist and conservative factions, struggles for leadership positions, and ideological disputes within the party, dissent and opposition movements. The Soviet Union witnessed the emergence of dissent and opposition movements that challenged the authority of the Communist Party. These movements, often advocating for democratic reforms and greater political freedoms, contributed to political fragmentation. Examples: the emergence of pro-democracy movements, human rights activists, and opposition figures like Andrei Sakharov and Boris Yeltsin. Regional autonomy demands. Political fragmentation was also fueled by demands for greater regional autonomy within the Soviet Union. Various regions sought to assert their own identities, protect their cultural heritage, and gain more control over local affairs. Examples: calls for autonomy from regions such as Crimea, Tatarstan, Chechnya, and Nagorno-Karabakh. Inter-ethnic conflicts. Ethnic tensions and conflicts further contributed to political fragmentation within the Soviet Union. Struggles for territorial control, clashes between different ethnic groups, and demands for self-determination heightened instability. Examples: the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, ethnic conflicts in Moldova and Tajikistan, and the war in Chechnya. Weak central authority. The weakening of central authority and the inability of the Soviet government to effectively manage political fragmentation eroded its power and control. The central government faced difficulties in maintaining law and order and responding to the demands and aspirations of diverse regions. Examples: the inability to prevent the breakup of the Soviet Union, the loss of control over secessionist regions, and the breakdown of central governance structures. Separatist movements. Political fragmentation was exemplified by separatist movements that sought full independence from the Soviet Union. These movements challenged the territorial integrity and unity of the Soviet state. Examples: the Transnistrian movement in Moldova, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia in Georgia, and the Chechen struggle for independence. These examples illustrate how political fragmentation, through the rise of nationalist movements, independence declarations, power struggles within the Communist Party, dissent and opposition movements, regional autonomy demands, inter-ethnic conflicts, weak central authority, and separatist movements contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. August coup. The failed coup attempt by hardliners in 1991 further eroded confidence in the Soviet government and accelerated the disintegration of the Union. Background and motivations. The August coup was an attempt by a group of hardline Communist Party officials to seize control of the Soviet government and halt the reforms initiated by Gorbachev. The plotters were motivated by their opposition to Gorbachev's policies of perestroika and glasnost, which they believed were leading to the erosion of the Soviet Union's power and influence. Examples: the coup leaders, including members of the State Committee on the State of Emergency, GCHIP, sought to restore centralized control, maintain the status quo, and preserve the Communist Party's authority. Declaration of the State of Emergency. On August 19, 1991, the coup leaders declared a state of emergency, establishing the State Committee on the State of Emergency as the de facto ruling body. They issued a series of decrees aimed at restricting civil liberties, censoring the media, and reasserting control over the Soviet government and society. Examples: decrees suspending political activities, shutting down independent media outlets, and imposing strict curfews. Popular opposition and civil resistance. The coup faced strong opposition from the Soviet population, who saw it as a threat to the ongoing democratic reforms and their aspirations for independence. Mass protests, strikes, and civil disobedience erupted in major cities across the Soviet Union, demonstrating popular resistance against the coup. Examples: crowds gathering in Moscow's streets, the defiance of the coup leader's orders, and the rallying cry of "We will not obey." Role of Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, emerged as a key figure in opposing the coup. Yeltsin's defiance and leadership played a crucial role in mobilizing popular resistance and rallying support against the coup. Examples: Yeltsin standing on a tank outside the Russian White House, delivering speeches to the crowds and urging civil servants and military personnel to resist the coup. Military loyalties and divisions. The coup revealed divisions within the Soviet military, as different units and commanders displayed varying levels of loyalty to the coup leaders. Some military personnel defied the coup leader's orders and sided with the pro-democracy forces. Examples: troops refusing to carry out orders, military units pledging loyalty to Yeltsin, and the formation of pro-democracy committees within the armed forces. International reactions. The international community condemned the coup and expressed support for the pro-democracy forces in the Soviet Union. World leaders called for a peaceful resolution, denounced the coup leaders, and expressed solidarity with the Soviet people. Examples: statements from US President George H.W. Bush, British Prime Minister John Major, and other world leaders urging a return to democratic processes. Failure and collapse of the coup. The coup ultimately failed to maintain control as the popular opposition, resistance within the military, and international pressure mounted against it. The coup leaders' inability to establish control and the collapse of their authority weakened the position of the Communist Party and further accelerated the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Examples: the coup leaders' arrest, their loss of control over key institutions, and the subsequent unraveling of the Soviet Union's political structure. Legacy of defeat. The failure of the coup had a lasting impact on the perception of the Communist Party and its ability to govern. It exposed the deep divisions within the party and eroded public confidence in its ability to lead the country. Examples: discrediting the hardline faction within the party, delegitimizing their authority, and hastening the party's demise. These examples illustrate how the August coup, through its impact on independence movements, weakening of Communist Party authority, acceleration of political reforms, shift in public opinion, erosion of central authority, symbolic significance, and its legacy of defeat contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Dissolution of the Soviet republics. The declaration of independence by various Soviet republics, starting with the Baltic states, eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union as a unified entity. Independence referendums. As the Soviet Union faced increasing political, economic, and social challenges, many of the republics held independence referendums to determine their future status. These referendums allowed citizens to vote on whether their republic should remain part of the Soviet Union or pursue independence. Examples: the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Holding referendums in 1991, Ukraine's referendum in 1991, and Georgia's referendum in 1991, and Georgia's referendum in 1991. Declarations of independence. Following the independence referendums, several Soviet republics declared their independence, asserting their sovereignty and breaking away from the Soviet Union. These declarations marked a significant shift in the political landscape and accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. Examples: the declarations of independence by Lithuania, 1990, Latvia, 1990, Estonia, 1991, Ukraine, 1991, Belarus, 1991, and others. Negotiations and agreements. In some cases, the dissolution of the Soviet republics involved negotiations between the Central Soviet government and the republics seeking independence. Agreements were reached that acknowledged the sovereignty of the republics and facilitated a peaceful separation. Examples: the Belovezha Accords, 1991, signed by Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, which declared the dissolution of the Soviet Union and established the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. Ethnic and nationalist movements. Ethnic and nationalist movements played a crucial role in advocating for independence and mobilizing support for secession. These movements drew upon cultural, historical, and ethnic identities to assert the rights of their respective nations and push for self-determination. Examples: the Baltic independence movements, the Ukrainian nationalist movement, the Armenian independence movement, and the Chechen struggle for independence, power struggles and political transitions. The dissolution of the Soviet republics was often accompanied by power struggles as new political leaders emerged and sought to establish governance structures. These transitions involved the formation of new governments, the adoption of new constitutions, and the establishment of diplomatic relations with other countries. Examples: the establishment of the Republic of Lithuania, Republic of Estonia, Republic of Latvia, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and other newly independent states. Economic challenges and transition. The dissolution of the Soviet republics brought about significant economic challenges as they transitioned from centrally planned economies to market-oriented systems. These transitions involved privatization, liberalization of trade, currency reforms, and the adoption of new economic policies. Examples: the implementation of economic reforms in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Georgia, and other newly independent states. Border disputes and conflict. The dissolution of the Soviet republics was not always peaceful, and border disputes and conflicts emerged in some regions. Disputes over territorial claims, ethnic tensions, and historical grievances fueled conflicts that further contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Examples: the conflicts in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Transnistria conflict in Moldova, and the war in Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia. International recognition. The recognition of newly independent states by the international community played a crucial role in their establishment and legitimacy. Recognition allowed for diplomatic relations, membership in international organizations, and access to economic cooperation. Shift in alliances and geopolitics. The dissolution of the Soviet republics resulted in a significant shift in alliances and geopolitical dynamics. Former Soviet republics sought to establish their own diplomatic relations, form new partnerships, and redefine their position in the global arena. Examples: the Baltic states joining NATO and the European Union, Ukraine's pursuit of closer ties with the West, and the reorientation of foreign policy in Georgia and Armenia. Formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. The dissolution of the Soviet Union led to the establishment of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, an organization formed by several former Soviet republics. The CIS aimed to foster cooperation and maintain some level of political and economic integration among its member states. Examples: the creation of the CIS as a platform for cooperation, joint security arrangements, and economic partnerships. Loss of central authority and legitimacy. The dissolution of the Soviet republics eroded the central authority and legitimacy of the Soviet government. With the departure of multiple republics, the central government was left with diminished power and influence. Examples: the disintegration of the Soviet Union into independent states, the loss of control over key territories, and the diminishing role of the central government. Impact on the Russian Federation. The dissolution of the Soviet republics had a profound impact on the Russian Federation, the largest successor state to the Soviet Union. Russia faced challenges in managing its own internal political and economic transitions while dealing with the implications of the dissolution. Examples: the redefinition of Russia's role as a post-Soviet state, economic restructuring, and the reassertion of Russian influence in the region. Impact on international relations. The dissolution of the Soviet republics had significant implications for international relations, with the emergence of new independent states and the realignment of alliances. The geopolitical landscape shifted, and countries had to adapt to the changing dynamics in the post-Soviet space. Examples: the need to establish diplomatic relations with newly independent states, negotiations over borders and assets, and the reconfiguration of geopolitical alliances. Legacy of fragmentation and independence. The dissolution of the Soviet republics left a lasting legacy of political fragmentation and the emergence of new independent states. It reshaped the political map of Eurasia and had long-term effects on governance, identity, and regional dynamics. Examples: the establishment of sovereign states such as Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, the Central Asian republics, and the Caucasus states. These examples illustrate how the dissolution of the Soviet republics through independence, referendums, declarations of independence, negotiations and agreements, ethnic and nationalist movements, power struggles, economic challenges, border disputes and conflicts, international recognition, shifts in alliances and geopolitics, the formation of the CIS, loss of central authority, impact on the Russian Federation, international relations, and the legacy of fragmentation and independence contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. 10 specific main events that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Perestroika and Glasnost. The introduction of Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost. Openness in the mid-1980s initiated significant political, economic, and social changes that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The fall of the Berlin Wall. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 symbolized the end of the Cold War division between East and West and marked a turning point in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Independence of Baltic states. The independence movements and subsequent declarations of independence by the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, in 1991 undermined the Soviet Union's territorial integrity and weakened its central authority. Failed August coup. The attempted coup by hardline Communist Party officials in August 1991, aimed at toppling Gorbachev and reversing his reforms, ultimately failed and further eroded the Soviet Union's political stability and legitimacy. Economic crisis and hyperinflation. The Soviet Union faced severe economic challenges, including stagnation, inefficiency, and shortages of basic goods. The collapse of the centrally planned economy, coupled with hyperinflation and economic mismanagement, contributed to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Rise of nationalist movements. The rise of nationalist movements across various Soviet republics challenged the unity and central authority of the Soviet Union. Movements advocating for independence and self-determination, particularly in Ukraine, the Baltic states, and the Caucasus region, weakened the Soviet Union's grip on power. Referendums and declarations of independence. Referendums held in several Soviet republics, including Ukraine and Belarus, resulted in declarations of independence, further fragmenting the Soviet Union and diminishing its authority. Economic liberalization in Eastern Europe. The economic liberalization and political changes in Eastern European countries, such as Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, which embraced market-oriented reforms, weakened the Soviet Union's influence over its satellite states and eroded its economic and political control. Disintegration of Warsaw Pact. The disintegration of the Warsaw Pact, the military alliance led by the Soviet Union and comprising several Eastern European countries, reflected the loss of Soviet influence in the region and undermined the Soviet Union's military and political standing. Creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. The establishment of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. In December 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, marked the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union and the emergence of independent states in its place. These events, along with other political, economic, and social factors, collectively contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War era, identifying a single reason for collapse. One key factor that had a profound impact on the Soviet Union's collapse was the inherent weaknesses and failures of its centrally planned economy. The Soviet Union's command economy, characterized by state control and centralized planning, suffered from chronic inefficiencies, resource misallocation, and lack of innovation. The system failed to adapt to changing global economic dynamics and was unable to meet the growing demands of its population. This economic stagnation undermined the country's productivity, competitiveness, and overall economic viability. The centrally planned economy struggled to incentivize individual initiative, entrepreneurship, and market-driven competition, resulting in low productivity, poor quality goods, and widespread shortages. The system hindered innovation and the efficient allocation of resources, leading to a decline in industrial output and an inability to keep pace with technological advancements. Moreover, the Soviet Union's centralized economic planning relied heavily on bureaucratic decision-making, which led to slow and cumbersome processes, stifled creativity, and hindered effective response to economic challenges. The lack of market mechanisms and price signals limited the ability to respond to supply and demand dynamics, exacerbating inefficiencies and distorting resource allocation. The economic challenges further exacerbated social and political discontent, eroding public trust and confidence in the Soviet system. The inability to provide a high standard of living, access to consumer goods, and economic opportunities contributed to growing dissatisfaction among the population. While the collapse of the Soviet Union cannot be attributed solely to its economic shortcomings, the fundamental failures of the centrally planned economy played a crucial role in undermining the country's stability, prosperity, and overall viability. The economic weaknesses ultimately contributed to a broader crisis of legitimacy, as well as political, social, and nationalistic forces that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories about the collapse of the Soviet Union have emerged over the years, offering alternative explanations beyond conventional historical accounts. It's important to note that these conspiracy theories lack substantial evidence and are often considered fringe or speculative. Here are 5 examples. Western sabotage theory. This theory suggests that Western intelligence agencies actively undermined the Soviet Union by funding and supporting dissident groups, promoting economic destabilization, and orchestrating political unrest. Proponents claim that the West sought to weaken the Soviet Union and accelerate its collapse. The Western sabotage theory suggests that Western intelligence agencies actively worked to undermine the Soviet Union, contributing to its collapse. Proponents of this theory argue that Western countries, particularly the United States, sought to weaken and dismantle the Soviet Union by various means. While it is important to note that this theory lacks substantial evidence and is widely regarded as speculative, let's explore it in more depth. Funding dissident groups. Supporters of the Western sabotage theory claim that Western intelligence agencies, such as the CIA, provided financial support and resources to dissident groups within the Soviet Union. The alleged intention was to foster opposition movements, amplify dissent, and challenge the authority of the Soviet government. Examples often cited include the funding of human rights organizations, pro-democracy groups, and independent media outlets that promoted anti-Soviet sentiments. Promoting economic destabilization. According to this theory, Western actors played a role in exacerbating economic challenges faced by the Soviet Union. Proponents argue that Western powers manipulated global economic conditions, conducted economic espionage, and encouraged policies that further strained the Soviet economy. Examples that have been suggested include covert operations to destabilize Soviet industries, funding activities that disrupted supply chains, and encouraging economic policies that contributed to inflation and shortages. Orchestrating political unrest. Supporters of the Western sabotage theory propose that Western intelligence agencies instigated or manipulated political unrest within the Soviet Union. This could involve covert operations to encourage or amplify ethnic tensions, support separatist movements, or provoke conflicts that would weaken the Soviet Union's control over its republics. Examples often cited include allegations of Western involvement in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, the Chechen independence movement, and other ethno-nationalist disputes within the Soviet Union. Intelligence operations. The theory suggests that Western intelligence agencies conducted extensive intelligence operations to gather information, exploit vulnerabilities, and manipulate events to their advantage. This could involve espionage, cyber operations, or other covert activities aimed at destabilizing Soviet institutions and decision-making processes. Examples may include alleged efforts to infiltrate Soviet government agencies, manipulate key policymakers, or sabotage strategic initiatives. Psychological operations. Proponents of the theory argue that Western powers engaged in psychological operations, PSYOPs, to shape public opinion and foster discontent within the Soviet Union. This could involve propaganda campaigns, disinformation campaigns, or other psychological techniques to undermine the legitimacy of the Soviet government and erode public confidence. Examples may include allegations of Western involvement in broadcasting anti-Soviet messages through radio stations or distributing anti-government literature within the Soviet Union. KB coup theory. According to this theory, the August 1991 coup attempt was not a genuine effort by hardline Communist Party officials to seize power, but rather a calculated move by elements within the KGB, Soviet Intelligence Agency, to engineer the collapse of the Soviet Union from within. The coup is seen as a controlled opposite. The KGB coup theory suggests that the August 1991 coup attempt in the Soviet Union was not a genuine effort by hardline Communist Party officials to seize power, but rather a calculated move by elements within the KGB, Soviet Intelligence Agency, to engineer the collapse of the Soviet Union from within. It proposes that the coup was controlled opposition orchestrated to facilitate a smooth transition to a post-Soviet era. It's important to note that this theory lacks substantial evidence and is widely regarded as speculative. However, let's explore it in more depth. Internal power struggles. Proponents of the KGB coup theory argue that there were internal power struggles within the Soviet leadership, including factions within the KGB itself. The theory suggests that certain KB officials sought to maintain control over the transition process and shape the future direction of the Soviet Union. Examples include alleged divisions between reform-minded officials, such as Gorbachev, and hardline elements within the KGB who wanted to preserve the existing Soviet system. Orchestrated timing and execution. Supporters of this theory claim that the timing and execution of the coup were carefully orchestrated to ensure its failure while creating the appearance of a serious challenge to Gorbachev's authority. They argue that the coup leaders intentionally avoided using overwhelming force and employed tactics that would spark popular resistance and opposition. Examples may include allegations that the coup leaders deliberately mishandled the situation, allowing protests and demonstrations to mobilize against them. Limited military support. The KB coup theory suggests that the coup leaders intentionally lacked full military support to ensure the failure of the coup. Proponents argue that the limited backing from the military was orchestrated to prevent a full-scale violent confrontation and minimize the potential for a civil war. Examples include claims that some military units and high-ranking officers either stayed neutral or actively undermined the coup leader's efforts, shifting the blame. According to this theory, the coup leaders aimed to shift blame and discredit hardline elements within the Communist Party and the KGB. The failed coup could be used as a pretext to sideline these elements and present Gorbachev and his reforms as the path forward for the Soviet Union. Examples may include allegations that the coup leaders deliberately made mistakes and acted in a manner that would later be seen as incompetent or misguided, facilitating transition to post-Soviet era. The KGB coup theory suggests that the coup was orchestrated to facilitate a smoother transition to a post-Soviet era rather than to maintain the existing Soviet system. Proponents argue that the coup aimed to provide an opportunity for Gorbachev and other reform-minded officials to further weaken the hardline elements and push for greater political and economic changes. Examples may include claims that the coup's failure paved the way for increased momentum towards independence movements and political reforms, to facilitate a smooth transition to a post-Soviet era. Economic warfare theory. This theory suggests that powerful international financial interests manipulated global economic conditions to intentionally undermine the Soviet Union's economy. It claims that speculative attacks on the ruble, economic sanctions, and other measures were orchestrated to weaken the Soviet Union and hasten its collapse. The economic warfare theory suggests that the collapse of the Soviet Union was facilitated by deliberate economic strategies and actions undertaken by external powers, particularly Western countries. Proponents of this theory argue that these powers manipulated global economic conditions and conducted economic warfare to weaken the Soviet Union's economy, contributing to its eventual collapse. It is important to note that this theory lacks substantial evidence and is considered speculative. However, let's explore it in more depth. Economic sanctions. Supporters of the economic warfare theory claim that Western countries imposed economic sanctions on the Soviet Union to cripple its economy and limit its international trade. They argue that these sanctions restricted access to vital resources, technology, and markets, hindering the Soviet Union's economic development and contributing to its decline. Examples include the imposition of trade embargoes, restrictions on technology transfers, and limitations on financial transactions with the Soviet Union. Manipulation of oil prices. Proponents of this theory argue that external powers manipulated global oil prices to destabilize the Soviet economy. They suggest that intentional overproduction or price manipulations aimed to drive down oil prices, which heavily impacted the Soviet Union as a major exporter of oil and gas. Examples may include allegations of concerted efforts by oil-producing countries or Western oil companies to flood the market with oil, thereby reducing prices and hurting Soviet revenue. Financial speculation. The economic warfare theory suggests that financial speculators, possibly working on behalf of external powers, exploited vulnerabilities in the Soviet economy to trigger economic crises. Proponents claim that speculation on the ruble and other Soviet assets led to currency devaluation, hyperinflation, and economic instability. Examples include allegations of speculative attacks on the ruble, orchestrated runs on Soviet banks, or deliberate manipulation of financial markets to weaken the Soviet Union's financial stability. Technological and intellectual property denial. Supporters of this theory argue that external powers limited access to advanced technology, scientific research, and intellectual property rights, hindering the Soviet Union's technological progress and economic competitiveness. They claim that intentional denial of critical technologies prevented the Soviet Union from keeping pace with global advancements and developing innovative industries. Examples include restrictions on the export of high-tech goods, denial of patents or licenses, and efforts to impede scientific collaboration with the Soviet Union. Sabotage of trade and supply chains. The economic warfare theory proposes that external powers undertook covert actions to disrupt Soviet trade and supply chains, causing disruptions and shortages. Proponents argue that efforts were made to undermine transportation networks, logistics, and infrastructure critical for the functioning of the Soviet economy. Examples may include allegations of sabotage of key transportation routes, targeted attacks on strategic infrastructure, or manipulation of supply chains to disrupt critical industries. Secret elite agenda theory. This theory proposes that a secretive group of elites, such as global financiers, multinational corporations, or secret societies, orchestrated the collapse of the Soviet Union to further their own global domination or geopolitical objectives. It suggests that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a predetermined outcome. The secret elite agenda theory suggests that a secretive group of elites, such as global financiers, multinational corporations, or secret societies, orchestrated the collapse of the Soviet Union to further their own global domination or geopolitical objectives. Proponents of this theory argue that these hidden actors manipulated events behind the scenes, exploiting vulnerabilities within the Soviet Union to bring about its collapse. It's important to note that this theory lacks substantial evidence and is widely regarded as speculative. However, let's explore it in more depth. Global dominance. Supporters of the secret elite agenda theory claim that powerful global actors sought to assert dominance and expand their influence over the world. They argue that the collapse of the Soviet Union facilitated the removal of a major geopolitical rival, allowing these hidden forces to extend their control over global affairs. Examples often cited include alleged connections between powerful elites, including bankers, corporate leaders, and politicians who purportedly benefited from the collapse of the Soviet Union. Economic interests. Proponents of this theory suggest that multinational corporations and financial institutions sought to exploit the vast resources and markets within the Soviet Union for their own economic gains. They argue that by orchestrating the collapse of the Soviet Union, these hidden actors aimed to gain access to valuable assets, industries, and markets previously under Soviet control. Examples may include allegations of behind the scenes economic deals, strategic investments, and efforts to secure advantageous business positions in the post-Soviet era. Geopolitical objectives. The secret elite agenda theory proposes that hidden forces pursued specific geopolitical objectives by engineering the collapse of the Soviet Union. They claim that the removal of the Soviet Union from the global stage allowed for the reshaping of regional dynamics and the redrawing of geopolitical boundaries. Examples often cited include alleged efforts to reshape the geopolitical landscape in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia with hidden agendas related to control over resources, strategic positioning, or containment of potential rivals. Control over energy resources. Supporters of this theory argue that hidden forces sought to gain control over valuable energy resources, particularly oil and gas reserves within the former Soviet territories. They suggest that the collapse of the Soviet Union provided an opportunity for these forces to exert influence over the newly independent states and secure access to energy resources. Examples may include allegations of covert agreements behind the scenes negotiations and strategic partnerships between hidden actors and local power structures. Secret society influence. Some proponents of the secret elite agenda theory speculate that secretive organizations or societies with global influence played a role in orchestrating the collapse of the Soviet Union. They claim that these hidden groups exerted their influence over political, economic, and social spheres to engineer the desired outcome. Examples often involve speculation around the influence of organizations such as the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, or other secretive entities. Alien influence theory. This theory speculates that extraterrestrial beings or advanced civilizations intervened in human affairs, including the collapse of the Soviet Union. It claims that these entities manipulated events. Behind the alien influence theory suggests that extraterrestrial beings or advanced civilizations played a role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Proponents of this theory argue that these entities intervened in human affairs, including geopolitical events, to shape the course of history. Preventing nuclear war. Supporters of the alien influence theory propose that extraterrestrial beings intervened to prevent a catastrophic nuclear conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. They suggest that these entities recognized the devastating consequences of a nuclear war and took actions to influence human decision-makers and de-escalate tensions. Examples may include claims of unidentified flying objects, UFOs, disabling nuclear weapons systems, or alleged encounters with extraterrestrial beings, delivering messages of peace to world leaders. Technological assistance. Proponents of this theory argue that extraterrestrial civilizations provided advanced technologies to select individuals or groups within the Soviet Union, thereby accelerating its collapse. They claim that these advanced technologies, whether in the fields of energy, communication, or weaponry, disrupted existing power structures and shifted the balance of power. Examples often involve speculative claims of secret collaborations between extraterrestrial beings and individuals within the Soviet Union who received advanced knowledge or assistance. Manipulating human consciousness. The alien influence theory suggests that extraterrestrial entities manipulated human consciousness to influence key decision-makers and shape the collapse of the Soviet Union. Proponents claim that these entities exerted mental or psychic influence, either directly or through mind-control technologies, to steer individuals towards actions that would lead to the collapse of the Soviet system. Examples may include alleged cases of individuals experiencing contact or communication with extraterrestrial beings, resulting in altered beliefs or behavior that contributed to the collapse. Accelerating societal changes. Supporters of this theory propose that extraterrestrial influence accelerated societal changes within the Soviet Union, destabilizing the existing system and leading to its collapse. They argue that these entities may have contributed to the rise of nationalism, the promotion of democratic ideals, or the dissemination of information that challenged the Soviet regime. Examples often involve speculative claims of extraterrestrial intervention in shaping cultural shifts, inspiring dissent, or supporting movements advocating for independence or political reform. Hidden alien agendas. Some proponents of the alien influence theory speculate that extraterrestrial beings had their own hidden agendas for intervening in human affairs, including the collapse of the Soviet Union. They propose that these entities may have sought to manipulate geopolitical dynamics, redirect global resources, or influence Earth's future trajectory for their own purposes. Examples often involve imaginative theories surrounding extraterrestrial motivations, intentions, and long-term plans that intersected with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The scenes, either to prevent a nuclear war or to influence the course of human history. Biological warfare theory. This theory suggests that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a result of covert biological warfare conducted by foreign powers. Proponents claim that the introduction of infectious diseases or bioweapons specifically targeting the Soviet population weakened the country, leading to its eventual collapse. The biological warfare theory suggests that the collapse of the Soviet Union was facilitated by covert biological warfare conducted by foreign powers. Proponents of this theory argue that the introduction of infectious diseases or bioweapons specifically targeting the Soviet population weakened the country and contributed to its collapse. Intentional spread of diseases. Supporters of the biological warfare theory claim that foreign powers intentionally spread infectious diseases or released bioweapons to weaken the Soviet population and undermine the stability of the country. They argue that targeted diseases were introduced through various means, such as contaminated food, water, or air, or through deliberate infection of individuals. Examples often cited include allegations of deliberate outbreaks of highly contagious diseases, such as influenza or other viral infections, aimed at causing mass illness and disrupting societal functions. Manipulation of epidemics. Proponents of this theory propose that foreign powers manipulated natural epidemics within the Soviet Union to exacerbate their impact and contribute to the country's collapse. They suggest that hidden actors may have withheld information, resources, or medical assistance during health crises, leading to increased mortality rates and societal destabilization. Examples may include claims of intentional manipulation of data, suppression of research findings, or deliberate interference with public health response efforts. Targeting agricultural sector. The biological warfare theory suggests that foreign powers may have targeted the Soviet Union's agricultural sector, aiming to disrupt food production and cause food shortages. Proponents argue that diseases or pests specifically introduced to agricultural systems could have devastated crops and livestock, leading to agricultural failures and subsequent economic decline. Examples often involve speculative claims of covert introduction of pests, plant diseases, or genetically modified organisms to undermine the productivity and stability of the Soviet agricultural sector. Biological agents as weapons. Supporters of this theory propose that bioweapons were covertly used against the Soviet Union as a means of destabilization and population control. They suggest that foreign powers may have developed and deployed sophisticated biological agents targeting specific ethnic or regional groups within the Soviet Union. Examples may include allegations of secret research programs, covert dissemination of biological agents, or the intentional release of genetically engineered pathogens, covert research and development. Proponents of the biological warfare theory claim that foreign powers conducted covert research and development of biological agents to specifically target the Soviet Union. They argue that advanced biotechnology, genetic engineering, or synthetic biology may have been employed to create highly virulent or drug-resistant pathogens for covert use. Examples often involve speculative claims of secret laboratories, hidden research programs, or clandestine collaborations between foreign actors and defectors from the Soviet scientific community. Energy manipulation theory. According to this theory, the collapse of the Soviet Union was orchestrated through manipulation of global energy markets and resources. Proponents argue that powerful entities deliberately manipulated oil prices, controlled energy supply chains, and engineered economic conditions that led to the collapse of the Soviet economy, ultimately bringing down the entire system. The energy manipulation theory suggests that the collapse of the Soviet Union was facilitated by the deliberate manipulation of global energy markets and resources by external powers. Proponents of this theory argue that powerful entities intentionally manipulated oil prices, controlled energy supply chains, and engineered economic conditions to weaken the Soviet Union's economy and contribute to its collapse. Manipulation of oil prices? Supporters of the energy manipulation theory claim that external powers exerted control over global oil prices to manipulate the Soviet Union's economy. They argue that intentional overproduction or price manipulations aim to drive down oil prices, which heavily impacted the Soviet Union as a major exporter of oil and gas. Examples often involve allegations of coordinated actions by oil-producing countries or Western oil companies to flood the market with oil, thereby reducing prices and hurting Soviet revenue, control of energy supply chains. Proponents of this theory suggest that external powers exerted control over energy supply chains, limiting the Soviet Union's access to crucial resources and markets. They argue that these entities may have influenced the routes, transportation networks, and infrastructure involved in energy trade, hindering the Soviet Union's ability to export its resources effectively. Examples may include claims of manipulation or control of pipelines, ports, and other critical energy infrastructure to restrict Soviet energy exports. Economic warfare through energy. The energy manipulation theory proposes that external powers engaged in economic warfare against the Soviet Union by strategically manipulating energy-related factors. Proponents argue that deliberate actions were taken to disrupt Soviet energy production, transportation, or trade, thereby impacting its economy and contributing to its collapse. Examples may include allegations of covert sabotage of energy facilities, intentional disruptions in energy supplies, or covert operations targeting key energy infrastructure. Resource denial. Supporters of this theory suggest that external powers intentionally denied the Soviet Union access to critical energy resources or technologies. They argue that limitations on technological advancements, exploration rights, or access to international markets for energy-related equipment and services undermined the Soviet Union's energy sector. Examples may include allegations of strategic embargoes or restrictions on the export of advanced technologies, denying the Soviet Union access to vital resources, exploitation of economic vulnerabilities. The energy manipulation theory proposes that external powers exploited economic vulnerabilities within the Soviet Union's energy sector. Proponents argue that hidden actors took advantage of inefficiencies, mismanagement, or corruption in the Soviet energy industry, exacerbating economic challenges and contributing to the country's collapse. Examples may include claims of covert actions to undermine Soviet energy infrastructure, siphoning off funds, or promoting policies that perpetuated inefficiencies in the sector. Secret technological advancements theory. This theory posits that secret technological advancements, such as advanced weaponry or mind control technologies, were employed to destabilize the Soviet Union from within. Proponents suggest that covert operations utilizing advanced technologies caused social and political unrest, leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The secret technological advancements theory suggests that hidden technological advancements, unknown to the public, played a significant role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Proponents of this theory argue that advanced technologies developed by secret organizations, governments, or extraterrestrial entities were used to undermine the Soviet Union from within. Advanced communication systems. Supporters of the secret technological advancements theory propose that hidden organizations or entities possessed advanced communication systems that allowed them to manipulate information flows within the Soviet Union. They claim that encrypted communication channels, satellite-based technologies, or sophisticated surveillance systems were used to disrupt official communications, influence public opinion, or coordinate opposition movements. Examples may involve speculative claims of undisclosed technologies that allowed hidden actors to intercept, alter, or control information dissemination channels within the Soviet Union. Mind control technologies. Proponents of this theory suggest that secret technologies capable of influencing human thoughts, behavior, or decision-making processes were employed to manipulate key individuals within the Soviet Union. They propose that hidden organizations or entities utilized mind control technologies, such as electromagnetic or acoustic manipulation, to shape the actions and decisions of Soviet leaders and undermine the stability of the system. Examples often involve speculative claims of undisclosed research programs or covert experiments aimed at manipulating human consciousness or influencing the minds of key decision makers. Covert energy weapons. The secret technological advancements theory proposes that hidden organizations or entities possessed advanced energy-based weapons that were used to destabilize the Soviet Union. Proponents suggest that covertly deployed energy weapons, such as directed energy weapons or scalar technologies, were employed to disrupt critical infrastructure, cause widespread power outages, or induce physical harm to individuals. Examples may include imaginative claims of secret weapon systems that could disable machinery, disrupt electrical grids, or create environmental anomalies that negatively impacted the Soviet Union's functioning. Genetic engineering and biotechnology. Supporters of this theory argue that undisclosed advancements in genetic engineering and biotechnology were used to manipulate the genetic makeup of individuals within the Soviet Union, contributing to societal unrest and instability. They propose that hidden organizations or entities possess the capability to alter human genetics, induce genetic diseases, or engineer specific traits, which could lead to social upheaval or health crises. Examples often involve speculative claims of covert research programs or secret collaborations that aim to develop genetic manipulation technologies for hidden agendas. Quantum computing and artificial intelligence. The secret technological advancements theory suggests that hidden organizations or entities possessed highly advanced quantum computing or artificial intelligence technologies that were leveraged to undermine the Soviet Union. Proponents argue that these undisclosed technologies could be used to infiltrate or disrupt critical systems, manipulate financial markets, or conduct sophisticated cyber operations that destabilize the Soviet economy and governance structures. Examples may include imaginative claims of supercomputers capable of bypassing encryption systems, predicting political outcomes, or orchestrating coordinated cyber attacks against the Soviet Union. Psychic warfare theory. This theory proposes that psychic or paranormal abilities were harnessed by certain groups or individuals to weaken the Soviet leadership and sow discord within the country. It suggests that psychic warfare techniques, such as remote viewing or mind manipulation, played a role in destabilizing the Soviet Union. The psychic warfare theory proposes that psychic or paranormal abilities were employed as a form of warfare to weaken the Soviet Union and contribute to its collapse. Proponents of this theory suggest that individuals or groups with psychic or supernatural capabilities harness their abilities to influence key events, manipulate manipulate decision makers, or sow discord within the Soviet leadership. Remote viewing. Remote viewing is a technique that claims to allow individuals to access information about distant or hidden targets using psychic abilities. Proponents of the psychic warfare theory argue that individuals skilled in remote viewing may have been employed to gather sensitive information about the Soviet Union's activities, which could then be exploited for strategic advantage. Examples may include claims that remote viewers provided insights on Soviet military installations, political decision-making processes, or covert operations, influencing the actions of external powers. Mind manipulation. This aspect of the psychic warfare theory suggests that individuals possessing psychic abilities may have targeted key decision-makers within the Soviet Union, manipulating their thoughts or influencing their decision-making processes. Proponents argue that these individuals could have used their psychic powers to implant suggestions, alter perceptions, or induce psychological states that contributed to internal conflicts or policy decisions leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Examples may involve claims that psychic manipulators influenced the thoughts and actions of Soviet leaders, leading to policy shifts or decisions that undermined the stability of the regime. Psychic assassination. Psychic assassination refers to the alleged use of psychic powers to harm or incapacitate individuals without direct physical contact. Proponents of the psychic warfare theory propose that hidden individuals with psychic abilities may have selectively targeted key figures within the Soviet leadership through psychic means. Examples may include claims that psychic assassins influenced the health or mental well-being of influential Soviet leaders, leading to the removal or weakening of key figures and causing destabilization within the Soviet regime. Information interception. This aspect of the psychic warfare theory suggests that individuals with psychic abilities may have intercepted or accessed sensitive information within the Soviet Union through non-conventional means. Proponents argue that these psychic individuals may have tapped into the psychic realm to gather intelligence, uncover secrets, or access classified information that could be used to undermine the Soviet system. Examples may involve claims that psychic individuals acquired classified documents, intercepted telepathic communications, or accessed hidden knowledge within the Soviet intelligence apparatus. Psychological warfare. Psychic abilities could have been harnessed for psychological warfare purposes, targeting the Soviet population to induce fear, dissent, or social unrest. Proponents of this aspect of the psychic warfare theory propose that individuals with psychic powers may have used their abilities to manipulate emotions, implant thoughts, or create psychic disturbances within the Soviet population, contributing to societal instability. Examples may include claims that psychic practitioners conducted mass scale psychic manipulations, influencing the collective consciousness of the Soviet people and contributing to the overall discontent and unrest that led to the collapse. Time travel interference theory. This theory speculates that time travelers from the future intervened in Soviet affairs, manipulating key events to ensure the collapse of the Soviet Union. It suggests that these time travelers had a vested interest in altering the course of history for their own purposes. The time traveler theory proposes that individuals or groups from the future traveled back in time to manipulate events and ensure the collapse of the Soviet Union. Proponents of this theory suggest that time travelers had specific motives, whether geopolitical, ideological, or strategic, and intervened in historical events to alter the course of history. Altered historical events. According to this theory, time travelers would have selectively altered key historical events within the Soviet Union to create a chain reaction leading to its collapse. Proponents argue that interventions could include manipulating decision-making processes, influencing political outcomes, or altering significant events that shaped the trajectory of the Soviet Union. Examples may involve claims that time travelers influenced the outcome of elections, sabotaged critical policies, or orchestrated events that triggered internal conflicts within the Soviet leadership. Covert influence on key figures. Proponents suggest that time travelers may have targeted key figures within the Soviet Union, exerting covert influence to shape their actions and decisions. They argue that these temporal agents could have assumed false identities, acted as advisors, or employed advanced technologies to subtly manipulate key individuals, influencing their beliefs and guiding their choices. Examples may involve claims that time travelers influenced the mindset of Soviet leaders, planted ideas, or provided critical guidance behind the scenes, ultimately leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Knowledge transfer. The time traveler theory proposes that individuals from the future could have shared advanced knowledge, technology, or strategic insights with select individuals or groups within the Soviet Union. Proponents suggest that these time travelers may have provided futuristic blueprints, scientific breakthroughs, or strategic intelligence that accelerated the collapse of the Soviet system. Examples may include claims that time travelers shared information about impending economic crises, highlighted vulnerabilities within the Soviet system, or provided solutions that ultimately led to its downfall. Altering technological advancements. This aspect of the time traveler theory suggests that time travelers may have directly influenced technological advancements within the Soviet Union, either by introducing future technologies or preventing specific developments. Proponents argue that these interventions could have disrupted key industries, impeded progress, or caused unforeseen consequences that weakened the Soviet Union's technological capabilities and economic stability. Examples may involve claims that time travelers sabotaged research projects, redirected funding, or provided alternative technological paths that ultimately undermined the Soviet Union's technological progress. Hidden agenda of temporal powers. Some proponents of the time traveler theory speculate that temporal powers, whether governments or advanced civilizations, had their own hidden agendas in altering the course of Soviet history. They propose that these time travelers manipulated events to ensure a specific outcome that aligned with their interests, whether it be geopolitical restructuring, societal evolution, or the prevention of potential future conflicts. Examples often involve imaginative theories surrounding the motivations, intentions, and long-term plans of these temporal powers, suggesting that the collapse of the Soviet Union served their greater strategic objectives. Cosmic alignment theory. This theory attributes the collapse of the Soviet Union to celestial phenomena or cosmic alignments that exerted invisible forces on Earth, disrupting social and political systems. It suggests that the alignment of planets, stars, or cosmic energies influenced human behavior, leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The cosmic alignment theory suggests that celestial phenomena, cosmic alignments, or astrological influences played a significant role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Proponents of this theory argue that the positions of planets, stars, or cosmic energies had an invisible and influential impact on Earth, disrupting social, political, and economic systems and ultimately leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Planetary alignments. The cosmic alignment theory proposes that specific alignments of planets or celestial bodies had a direct influence on human affairs, including geopolitical events. Proponents argue that rare or significant planetary alignments created energetic shifts that disrupted the equilibrium of the Soviet Union, leading to social unrest, political conflicts, and economic challenges. Examples may involve claims that specific planetary alignments coincided with key events or turning points in the Soviet Union's history, such as uprisings, political shifts, or economic downturns. Astrological significance. This aspect of the cosmic alignment theory suggests that astrological forces or celestial energies affected the behavior and decision-making processes of individuals within the Soviet Union. Proponents argue that the positions of celestial bodies in relation to astrological signs influence the mindset, temperament, and actions of Soviet leaders, leading to internal conflicts, policy shifts, or other influential decisions. Examples may include claims that astrological events, such as significant planetary transits or alignments, coincided with major political shifts or decisions within the Soviet Union. Cosmic energies. Proponents of the cosmic alignment theory suggest that cosmic energies emanating from celestial phenomena or cosmic sources had a direct impact on the energetic balance of the Soviet Union. They argue that these energies disrupted social, economic, and political structures, leading to societal unrest, economic instability, and the erosion of the Soviet system. Examples may involve claims that cosmic events, such as solar flares, geomagnetic storms, or other energetic phenomena, coincided with periods of turmoil or upheaval within the Soviet Union. Metaphysical influences. This aspect of the cosmic alignment theory proposes that metaphysical forces or higher dimensional energies influenced the collapse of the Soviet Union. Proponents suggest that these unseen influences transcended physical reality and played a role in shaping human consciousness, societal dynamics, and geopolitical events, ultimately leading to the collapse. Examples may include claims that metaphysical energies or spiritual forces acted as catalysts for change, triggering shifts in perception, values, and social structures within the Soviet Union. Symbolic representations. Supporters of the cosmic alignment theory argue that cosmic phenomena served as symbolic representations or omens of the impending collapse of the Soviet Union. They suggest that specific cosmic events, celestial configurations, or cosmic symbolism acted as signs or warnings, reflecting the underlying instability and eventual demise of the Soviet system. Examples may involve claims that celestial events, such as comets, eclipses, or rare astronomical occurrences, were interpreted as symbolic indicators of the impending collapse of the Soviet Union. Quantum reality manipulation theory. This theory proposes that hidden entities or advanced civilizations manipulated quantum realities or parallel dimensions to engineer the collapse of the Soviet Union. It suggests that these entities had the ability to manipulate probabilities and alter the trajectory of historical events. The quantum reality manipulation theory proposes that hidden entities or advanced civilizations manipulated quantum realities or parallel dimensions to engineer the collapse of the Soviet Union. Proponents of this theory suggest that these entities had the ability to manipulate probabilities, alter timelines, or influence the fabric of reality itself. Probability manipulation. The quantum reality manipulation theory suggests that hidden entities or advanced civilizations possess the capability to manipulate quantum probabilities. Proponents argue that these entities could selectively alter the probabilities of events within the Soviet Union, favoring outcomes that would lead to its collapse. Examples may involve claims that improbable or unlikely events occurred with higher frequency during critical periods within the Soviet Union, contributing to social unrest, political instability, or economic challenges. Timeline alteration. This aspect of the quantum reality manipulation theory proposes that hidden entities or advanced civilizations had the ability to manipulate timelines, branching into different realities or parallel dimensions. Proponents argue that these entities selectively altered the course of events within the Soviet Union, diverting it onto a path that would lead to its collapse. Examples may involve claims that critical events within Soviet history unfolded differently in alternative timelines or dimensions, ultimately leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the observed reality. Reality resonance. The quantum reality manipulation theory suggests that hidden entities or advanced civilizations could influence the resonance or vibrational frequency of reality. Proponents propose that these entities could manipulate the energetic structure of reality, affecting the thoughts, emotions, and behaviors of individuals within the Soviet Union, ultimately contributing to its collapse. Examples may involve claims that hidden forces altered the vibrational frequency of collective consciousness, causing widespread discontent, polarization, or societal upheaval within the Soviet Union. Quantum entanglement. Proponents of this theory suggest that hidden entities or advanced civilizations used quantum entanglement to manipulate events and outcomes within the Soviet Union. They propose that by establishing quantum entanglement with key individuals, objects, or systems, these entities could exert influence over their behavior or manipulate their environments. Examples may include claims that hidden forces established entanglement with Soviet leaders, institutions, or critical infrastructure, leading to disruptions, conflicts, or systemic failures that contributed to the collapse. Consciousness coherence. This aspect of the quantum reality manipulation theory proposes that hidden entities or advanced civilizations manipulated the coherence of human consciousness within the Soviet Union. Proponents argue that these entities could induce shifts in consciousness, alter perception, or manipulate the collective mindset, ultimately leading to societal unrest and the collapse of the Soviet system. Examples may involve claims that hidden forces influence the thoughts, beliefs, or values of individuals within the Soviet Union, creating conditions conducive to social and political upheaval. Hidden knowledge suppression theory. This theory suggests that ancient or esoteric knowledge suppressed by powerful organizations or secret societies contained insights that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It proposes that this hidden knowledge, if accessed or revealed, would have unveiled the weaknesses or vulnerabilities of the Soviet system. The hidden knowledge suppression theory suggests that powerful organizations or secret societies have suppressed ancient or esoteric knowledge that, if revealed, could have contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Proponents of this theory argue that hidden knowledge containing insights about the vulnerabilities or weaknesses of the Soviet system has been intentionally withheld from the public. Ancient technologies. The hidden knowledge suppression theory proposes that ancient civilizations possessed advanced technologies or knowledge that could have exposed flaws within the Soviet Union's governance and infrastructure. Proponents argue that powerful organizations or secret societies intentionally suppressed the dissemination of this ancient knowledge to maintain their control and prevent the revelation of information that could challenge existing power structures. Examples may involve claims that ancient texts or artifacts contain information about alternative energy sources, governance models, or societal structures that could have undermined the Soviet system. Historical archives. Proponents of this theory suggest that hidden organizations or secret societies have control over historical archives containing crucial information about the Soviet Union's vulnerabilities. They argue that these organizations actively suppress or manipulate historical records, preventing the wider public from accessing knowledge that could shed light on the weaknesses or internal challenges faced by the Soviet Union. Examples may involve claims of secret archives that house undisclosed documents, testimonies, or evidence that could expose corruption, mismanagement, or other detrimental factors within the Soviet system. Forbidden scientific discoveries. This aspect of the hidden knowledge suppression theory proposes that scientific discoveries or breakthroughs that could have impacted the Soviet Union were intentionally suppressed. Proponents suggest that powerful entities, such as government agencies or influential corporations, controlled scientific research and selectively suppressed or concealed findings that could have unveiled vulnerabilities within the Soviet system. Examples may include claims that suppressed scientific discoveries could have exposed flaws in the Soviet economy, undermined key industries, or revealed alternative technologies that surpassed Soviet capabilities. Occult and esoteric knowledge. Proponents argue that occult or esoteric knowledge associated with secret societies or ancient mystical traditions contains hidden insights that could have contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. They propose that powerful organizations or secret societies guarded this knowledge, suppressing its dissemination to maintain their influence and control over global affairs. Examples may involve claims that occult knowledge contains information about spiritual forces, hidden power structures, or alternative systems of governance that could have challenged the Soviet regime. Alternative historical narratives. This aspect of the hidden knowledge suppression theory suggests that alternative historical narratives or suppressed information could reveal critical details about the Soviet Union's vulnerabilities. Proponents argue that mainstream historical accounts are intentionally distorted or manipulated to conceal information that could challenge existing power structures or reveal weaknesses within the Soviet system. Examples may include claims that suppressed historical narratives, oral traditions, or alternative viewpoints provide insights into covert operations, hidden agendas, or internal conflicts within the Soviet Union.